Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for being here. This is obviously a tragedy, one that already has Israeli officials calling for retribution. Deputy Defense Minister Danny Danon posting on his Facebook under a picture of the three boys, "The tragic end of the boys must be the end of Hamas." Could we see a full-scale war here against Hamas?
Well, we have to understand what Hamas is. Hamas is a terror organization. It's committed to Israel's destruction. They have fired thousands of rockets at our cities. They've dispatched dozens, scores of suicide bombers at our civilians, and they are responsible for the murder of these three boys.
How do you know? I have not heard that they've taken credit
Members
for it.
of Hamas, it doesn't matter whether they took credit or they didn't take credit. In fact, the head of Hamas celebrated the kidnapping today and called for more kidnappings. We know that members of Hamas in the Hebron area, they're the ones who are responsible. And my prime minister was very clear, Hamas is responsible and Hamas will pay a very heavy price. That's the decisions that they're making right now in Jerusalem, because as we speak here, they are having a cabinet meeting right now in Jerusalem.
How do you make sure that it's only Hamas that pays the price and not innocent Palestinians who happen to live in the same area?
Well, we do everything we can in order to not harm Palestinian civilians. The problem we face with Hamas is Hamas both fires rockets at our civilians and hides behind civilians. They use civilians as human shields. So it makes it very difficult for Israel to conduct these anti-terror activities, but we do it. And I think we do it in a way that maybe no other country in the world does. We go out of our way to not harm Palestinian civilians. That's the difference between us and the terrorists. They deliberately kill our civilians. We do everything to keep their civilians out of harm's way. And one other Palestinian leader has condemned this act. We appreciate very much that he's condemned this kidnapping. But at the same time, he actually has a government with the kidnappers. It's one thing for him to condemn terrorism. It's another thing for him to sit in a government with a bunch of terrorists. And that's why we call on the international community to put pressure on President Abbas and to tell him he has to choose peace with Israel or pact with Hamas. He can't have both.
I want to read a comment from Hamas in response to what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu fingered Hamas and said they were responsible for the kidnappings, vowed action. Hamas had put out the statement saying his threats do not scare Hamas. If he is willing to start a war in Gaza, then the gates of hell will be open to him. What is the Israeli government going to do next? Should we expect jets to bomb areas where you believe Hamas fighters to be?
Well, we're just going to have to wait and see, but I can tell you one thing, Jake, for sure. We have a very responsible and serious leadership in Jerusalem, and they will make the decisions they have to make in order to send a very strong message to Hamas that this action is unacceptable and to take the action that they deem necessary in order to protect and to defend our population.
What was the excuse after the news came out that Hamas didn't kill those teens?
Well, the
or
thing
is that
is,
under speculation?
No, the thing is, Netanyahu is a politician, and he understands the memory of people is very short. So he knew eventually it would come out, but then they would forget what precipitated the whole conflict. And so he didn't acknowledge what now seems to be the case. Number one, Hamas had nothing to do with the abductions, and Hamas had nothing to do with the killings, which occurred almost immediately. Not they were looking for the kidnappers. They knew the kids were dead. But he exploited the opportunity, exploited the occasion. Hamas at first held back, but other factions in Gaza did not hold back. And soon it began to spin out of control, which is exactly what Netanyahu wanted. And the so-called rockets started to be fired at Israel. And now Netanyahu had his pretext to go in, knock out Hamas, and as the expression in Israel has it, to mow the lawn again in Gaza. Then the question came about mounting the ground or launching the ground invasion, because the air attacks couldn't stop the rockets from going towards Israel. Again, rockets in quotes. I'll get to that later, but they're not really rockets. Netanyahu had a problem. Launched the ground invasion, it meant probably there would be significant Israeli combatant casualties. Israel does not tolerate significant combatant casualties.
Well, joining us now from Tel Aviv is the Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman, Mark Regev. Mark Regev, before all this began, not that long ago, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority were sharing power in the West Bank. That, of course, heralded the possibility of some degree of unity in any peace talks with you. That has been shot to pieces by this. Is there any hope now of any kind of central discussion with the Palestinians and perhaps listening to what Mr. Obama has said today, which is go for a ceasefire now?
Well, if we come out of this with Hamas substantially weakened, with Hamas discredited in the eyes of the Palestinians for initiating and causing this crisis, with Hamas most of all discredited amongst the people of Gaza who didn't want this war in the first place, it's possible that the more moderate forces will have energy and momentum, and that could be a good thing for the peace process.
The problem, though, surely is that this is a question of loss of face on both sides. Neither side can afford to do so. It is said that Hamas have 10,000 of these rockets. You've eroded perhaps 6 of them. That means there's 8,000 to go. There is terrible suffering going on now in the Gaza sector. And it's very hard to see that it's possible to continue this war without the complete destruction of a civilian population.
No, I disagree. Our goal here is to come out of this with a sustained period of quiet. I mean, ultimately, our goal is defensive. We want peace and quiet for the Israeli civilian population so that they don't have to live in fear of an incoming rocket or terrorists infiltrating the border from Gaza. That's doable. It's doable by doing 2 things. One, by our military action today against the Hamas military machine. That machine is being depleted as we speak. And secondly, if Hamas leaders come out of this understanding that they simply cannot target Israeli civilians with impunity.
But you've had peace and quiet, as you put it, a good number of times down the last decade or so and more, and you did nothing with it.
I disagree. We've wanted to negotiate. We've wanted to move forward. What does Hamas say? Hamas opposes any negotiations with Israel. Hamas denies my country's very right to exist. And Hamas has declared war on every single Israeli civilian, man, woman, and as we saw 2 weeks ago, children as well. Hamas is the antithesis of peace and reconciliation. And as such, if Hamas comes out of this weakened, as to refer to your first question, I think that could give new momentum to the peace process.
But in truth, what you've done, surely, is to erode everything by continuing to build utterly internationally unacceptable and illegal settlements in land that isn't yours. And that has been the single most destructive aspect of the whole relationship between you and Palestine.
I know that's the conventional wisdom, but if you'll allow me to challenge it, I'd like to say the following sentence. Actually, in Gaza, we took down all the settlements. In Gaza, we removed them, and those settlers who didn't want to leave, we forced them to leave. And we pulled back to the 1967 lines in Gaza. Now, I would ask you, what has the Palestinian body politic done to want to encourage us to do that again? And until the Palestinians can answer that question,
well, let me put that,
because when we took down settlements and when we pulled out,